21st century warfare is very different because of drones, because of what they do to the front lines, but what they do in terms of depth as well. And here Hegseth is in the middle of the conflict, firing two of the generals who are in charge of this, right, for political reasons. Just got to be point blank about this. And what it tells you, I think, is there are some people in the Trump administration, and I would go to the military, who knew and are the adults in the room in terms of what could have happened here, but they are not the voices that are being heard or that were influential at key moments in the past, 38 days.
From a military planning perspective, I know as a planner looking at the region, the first thing that we looked at was the Iranians closing the Straits of Hormuz, doing it from a temporary perspective and then doing it from a more permanent perspective and the systems that they use that. So the military planners will have known that. The professional political planners will have known that. Now, the reaction against the various Gulf states, given the fact that this is an extension of a historical Sunni Shia civil war that's been going on for centuries, then an Iranian response against some of those that aren't following the Iranian branch is something that we could have expected. And therefore that should not have caught anyone with their unawares.
Yeah, and again, just the fact that if you game this out, Philip, look, if you like, let's say you anticipate we're going to strike and try to kill the top of their leadership and make them surrender. Wouldn't you game out the fact that the regime's going to do anything it can to survive? So you factor in the possibility of everything.
From a planning perspective, we know that they've done that. We know that they've built huge underground bunkers. We know that they've had those for weapon stores. They've had those for their nuclear program. They've had those for their command and control. They've spent decades building stuff that they knew the biggest bombs that could be dropped on them, and they made them bomb-proof from those big bombs. So we knew that they were ready for this.
Yeah. So let me tell you two stories that intersect. I'll tell you what. First is that just before going to the war on February 28th, it got leaked to the media, and I suspect it was officials probably from inside the military or former military officials who were connected with current military officials, that General Dan Kane, the chair of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff, told the Trump administration, if we're in a protracted war with Iran, we've got difficulties here. We've got difficulties with our stocks, in part because we've got to expend a lot of weaponry to try to make them surrender. Think about the expenditure of Tomahawk missiles, for example, that have taken place. But also because we've only got limited stocks of those very expensive interceptors if they continue to fire missiles and drones. And he was exactly on the mark in terms of how that's played out. I do think it's possible that someone like J.D. Vance listened to Kane. I don't think Vance is supporting the operation, but of course, he's not going to publicly object to it. That's story one.
Hegseth didn't listen to him.
And that's story two. Not only did Hegseth not listen, what has happened in the last few days? In the middle of a war, Pete Hegseth has continued the purge of top commanders that the Trump administration has been pursuing since the start of term two, because they want loyalists in there. So who is it that he gets rid of? Set aside for the moment, he gets rid of Major General William Green, who is the head chaplain for the military. We can talk about this Christian nationalism kick that Hegseth is on and how it causes complications. Set that aside. Who were the other two? One of them is one of the 8 members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Army Chief of Staff, Randy George. The other is David Houdna, a 4-star general. What links those two? Both of them have been instrumental in terms of transformation and training. George has been big on the transformation of the U.S. military for 21st century warfare. Houdna is the chair, was the head of the Transformation and Training Command. Now, as you and I have discussed with relation to Ukraine and Russia, 21st century warfare is very different because of drones, because of what they do to the front lines, but what they do in terms of depth as well. And here Hegseth is in the middle of the conflict, firing two of the generals who are in charge of this, right, for political reasons. Just got to be point blank about this. And what it tells you, I think, is there are some people in the Trump administration, and I would go to the military, who knew and are the adults in the room in terms of what could have happened here, but they are not the voices that are being heard or that were influential at key moments in the past, 38 days.
Do you think behind closed doors, senior military commanders are going and voicing their concerns about what's going on, and that's part of the reason why there's the purge? And expanding on that, you touched on what's going on inside Ukraine, and we are supposed to be talking Ukraine on Frontline. Do you think what we're seeing in Iran and with Donald Trump's approach to Iran and Pete Hegseth's approach and everything else is symptomatic of him making the same mistakes that he has failed to learn from his approach to Russia and Ukraine and the conflict in Europe?
I don't think these are mistakes, Philip. I think that Hegseth and Trump wouldn't see it as mistakes. This is just simply the path they pursue with Ukraine and Russia and with Iran. And I think what we're talking about here is the consequences of that. Right now, again, to bring it back, to get from Iran and then get across to Ukraine. The reason why Randy George was fired, apparently the tipping point, was not actually this key point about transformation and the military. He was fired because of this agenda that the Trump folks have in terms of loyalty, which they hook on the idea of trashing a woke military, whatever that means. And Philip, I've met a lot of military folks in my time, got a great deal of respect for them. I would say very few of them would qualify as woke in terms of the way that Donald Trump is using it. All right. If anything, I think some of them and I would have very polite, but let's say full and frank discussions about cultural issues. But beyond that, of course, the Trump people say these are commanders who are in favor of diversity, equality, and inclusion, which are really bad things. Why do I say that? The story is that there was a list of very qualified officers that were coming up for promotion to go to one-star generals. All of a sudden, Hegseth's office struck 4 names off that list. 2 of them happened to be black officers. 2 of them happened to be women officers. George spoke up and said, look, these are very, very qualified people. What are the reasons here why they're being struck? Hegseth took offense at that, and that Trumpian agenda cuts across any type of military rationale at that point. And I would say that Trumpian agenda cuts across the military rationale in a wider sense until you get to this point. I think the Trump administration is facing the Rubicon moment. Either you have to pull back and go into talks with Iran, not an ultimatum to the Iranians, but talks, or you have to put in ground troops. It cannot be proven because the military are not going to speak out. Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is not going to say this publicly like he did yesterday, but I suspect the military are advising folks in Trump's inner circle, look, if you go in with ground troops, this isn't going to be easy. There are going to be, there are going to be quite serious consequences in terms of the immediate consequences that you'll have Iranian resistance, but then the knock-on effects about what's going to happen across the country and what's going to happen, for example, on the Strait of Hormuz. That's why I think Trump, for all the bluster, is wobbling. I think the bluster covers up the fact that he can increase the bombing on civilian infrastructure, but to take that step to put the ground troops in, partly because of also domestic opposition, but partly because of the military advice. That's where the military, I think, still has an influence. If I was to take it across to Ukraine, though, what I would say is that the Trump folks have left the building. We knew they were going to leave the building anyway, that there were adults in the room that were keeping U.S. support for Ukraine going, whether it was selling arms through NATO to Ukraine, whether it was getting the sanctions on the Russians. The Trump folks have just simply checked out now because their priority is not just trying to get regime surrender, it's the global oil price. And what we're seeing on the Ukraine front, perhaps we can expand on this a minute, is that realignment that we thought was going to have to take place, which is not just Europe, it's also other countries. It's Canada, it's Australia, it's other Asian countries, it's Japan. They're going to have to actually proceed with Ukraine on the basis of that the Americans are out. Except at that level of discussions, as you and I are referring to, that you still have American military officers you can talk to. You still have American intelligence officers you can talk to. There's probably still some intelligence sharing that goes on. But in terms of that administration support for Ukraine, no, you have to do it.
But do you think Zelensky saw that? And with his move into the Gulf region, sending experts in on counter-drone warfare, and then setting up deals with the Saudis and all the rest of it, was effectively him turning around to Donald Trump and giving him the bird. Playing his cards when Donald Trump in the Oval Office had said, "You've got no cards to play," just sticking his thumb in his nose and doing that. Saying, not only have I got cards, but I can start to influence things that you have started and can't deal with.
President Zelensky would be too polite to putting his thumb to his nose, and he'd be too pragmatic.
I'm not.
I know, but that's why you're not the Ukraine president at this point, right? And he's very pragmatic about this. So he never referred to the United States when he made that tour. But you're absolutely right to highlight that tour, Philip, because what Ukraine does, of course, weeks ago is they make that move in, and again, they see the situation. And I suspect the American military would have told them about this. The American military are sitting there with, what is it? Each Patriot interceptor is $4 million. Missile is $4 million. Each THAAD, however you wish to pronounce that acronym, is $12 million. Right? The Iranians are sending in drones, which are a few thousand each. Right? Okay. Well, you do the math here. The Americans cannot manufacture enough interceptors to replenish those that they're expending. So who's going to step in? And Ukraine saw this coming. Again, the defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, one of the biggest people to keep an eye on these days, right? And they went in and they make the offer to the Americans, but they make the offer also specifically to the Gulf states, right? Okay, what happens a few weeks later? Zelensky goes to Saudi Arabia, meets Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto leader, 10-year defense cooperation agreement. It's just a general agreement. We don't know the specifics on it, but they can announce it. Goes to Qatar, meets the Emir. UAE meets the key player there, Mohammed bin Zayed. Same thing happens in each of those countries. So what we got now is Ukraine sending in their experts and their weapons, and in return, they're going to get, I think at the least, financial assistance, and they're going to get energy assistance. And that's where you have to be ahead of the game here, because not only do you have the problems with the Americans, you've got our good friend Viktor Orban, the mouse to Vladimir Putin's lion. We can talk about that later, who is helping the Kremlin by blocking the 90 billion euro European Union loan. So I think that and again, also, by the way, it was not just the Gulf countries. Add in one more that Zelensky went to as well, which is Turkey. So he met Erdogan in Turkey as well. Turkey's a huge player across the Middle East. We know that, but Turkey's also a NATO member, right? And so I think Ukraine has played a blinder the last few weeks, both in terms of the diplomacy, and then another topic we may touch on with the fact that they are now carrying out strikes inside Russia, which I don't think have to rely on